I have put together this presentation showcasing my OER learnings this semester. Openness is a value, and there's two foundations or core beliefs of openness, and those are sharing and gratitude. Sharing is a fundamental value of open education. Others have shared with me, so in turn, I want to express my gratitude and share with others. We can lift each other up and support one another by sharing our knowledge and educational resources. As a whole, we can move mountains. Gratitude means we're grateful for what others have shared with us. We express our gratitude through sharing with others, and we try to lift one another up. Intellectual property laws protect one's work from thieves. This means that I can't take something that you create and then sell it for money because that's yours. However, it hinders innovation and they're unknowingly easy to violate. We can even violate intellectual property laws without knowing that we've done so. A lot has changed since the 1950s because then it was very difficult to infringe upon intellectual property rights and laws. So we can see how through the increased use of technology, the internet age, the information technology age, all of these different innovations and advances has really changed the way that people view intellectual property laws and how easy they are to violate. Open equals free plus permissions. This is something that really stuck out to me this semester because I learned that most free is in the public domain and some least free Creative Commons licenses are actually not OER because you cannot engage in the 5 permissions with those, which I will get to in a moment. But I found this to be really useful because we learned a lot about Creative Commons licensing and even things like companies getting sued because they're printing things off for schools or educators or people that are trying to distribute these resources to learners. And companies are getting sued for printing the materials off, but really they're not making a profit off of it. So there's still a lot of gray areas and things where it's not entirely flushed out, or some ways that people license things just doesn't really enable that being open and free to use and things like that. But it's an important thing to remember, a fundamental principle of Creative Commons licensing. And that's if the work falls under one of these 3 categories, so fair use, fair dealing, or another applicable limitation or exception, you do not need to rely on a Creative Commons license for terms and conditions. You can just use that resource if it falls in one of those 3 categories. I mentioned the 5R activities, and Dr. David Wiley, came up with the 5Rs to showcase the benefits and freedoms of a resource with an open license. And so the 5Rs are retain, revise, reuse, remix, and redistribute. So retain is the right to make, own, and control copies of the work. Revise is the right to change, tailor, modify, or transform the content itself. Reuse means that you have the right to use the content in multiple ways. Remix is the right to merge the original or revised content with other open content to create new content. And redistribute is the right to distribute copies of the original content, your alterations, or your remixes with others. So these 5Rs are fundamental to OER. Retaining information and resources is key, however. Retain is a prerequisite to revise and remix because it's essential that we can retain these resources. And let's go back to this for a second. Retain means make, own, and control copies of the work. If you can't do that, then you can't engage in the other R's. You can't revise the material if you can't retain it. You can't remix the material if you can't retain it. So retaining is a fundamental R, and it's kind of prerequisite to everything else. Open education resources are free to access. So that means they are publicly available for us to find and use in our classroom or learning experiences. And as I mentioned before, they're openly licensed, so you can and should be able to engage in the 5 Rs. If you can't engage in the 5 Rs, then it's not openly licensed and it's not open education resources. So I did an analysis of the definitions of OER, and some of the things that came up is it must be free. Others say that they must reside in the public domain. Some believe the OER must be freely used and redistributed. And after what I've learned this semester, I think free needs to be defined in a way that truly represents what OER is, because I don't necessarily agree that it must be free in an undefined term, because to me that means they must be free for everyone or no cost. And we've learned that not all OER is free. Let's look at Dr. Wiley's Lumen Learning. It isn't necessarily free for the students. They have to pay a small amount, like what, $20 or something like that, we've heard. And so it's not always free, but it means that it's freely open to redistribute and remix and revise and retain and engage in the 5 Rs, but it's not necessarily free at a cost always. So it may mean that students can have course materials for a significantly lower cost. And that leads me to my next point of zero textbook cost versus OER. As this chart shows, OER doesn't always mean zero cost. Here we can see that this column is zero textbook cost. So some of it is OER, as we can see that this row is OER, but we can also see that OER falls in areas that cost more than being free or $0. So I think it's important to note that free needs to be defined in a way that doesn't always necessarily mean it's going to be free for everyone at a cost standpoint, because zero textbook cost versus open education resources are two different concepts and two different types of resources. So that's something that was really important to me to understand and to clarify. So I looked into how I can find OER to be able to use it more for my learning experiences. So this is just a quick guide on how to find OER on Google. So first, you should search for the topic on Google. I just picked marketing because that's something I'm familiar with, and I figured that some resources would come up for that. So once you do your Google search, you click on settings here and you go down to advanced search. At the bottom of the screen, you're going to see usage rights. And here you're going to click on where it says not filtered by license, and you're going to filter it by free to use, share, or modify, even commercially. And you're going to perform your advanced search, and that will bring up your OER resources for your particular topic. So I just thought that that was something that was useful for me to remember how to do when I'm looking for course materials or instructional materials and things like that. I found the COOP framework to be particularly useful. I chose to actually do one of my creates one week on the COOP framework because it just really stuck out to me. So the Open Education Group says that the COOP framework is their approach to studying the impact of open educational resources and open technology in secondary and post-secondary education. So the COOP framework stands for cost, outcomes, usage, and perceptions. I created this slide to outline the different impacts and considerations of each of the components of the COOP framework. So these are just some considerations for each of the 4 main areas identified in the COOP, so the cost, outcomes, usage, and perceptions. And it gives you different considerations to think about to determine the impact of the OER resources that you're using. I also found the OER Research Hub research framework to be interesting as I looked more into it. It really seeks to provide answers and evidence to answer the question of what is the impact of OER on learning and teaching practices. And I think this is really important because a lot of people are still looking at the impact and seeing how students perform better, or how this can change their experience, and how this can also help teachers adapt their practices and the impact that it has on them. So they really had two main hypotheses. They broke it down more detailed into further hypotheses to actually test. But the two main categories that these hypotheses fall into is the use of OER leads to improvement in student performance and satisfaction. And the open aspect of OER creates different usage and adoption patterns than other online resources. So they really are looking to see if they can confirm that OER really does lead to improvements in student performance and satisfaction. And they're also looking at how the open aspect of OER creates different usage and adoption patterns other than just online resources. So their motivating problems are framed in terms of an evidence gap tied between the benefits and barriers of widely adopting OER. So OER is facing the potential to be widely adopted, but two key elements, benefits and barriers, lack evidence. They lack strong research that shows these are the benefits and these are the barriers. And it really isn't known altogether why OER hasn't been more widely adopted. Yeah, a lot of people don't know about it. It's not really something that a lot of people know about, although research has shown too that there's a high percentage that of instructors that do know about it or have heard of it. So I think that it's just about continuing the movement to really encompass more research like what the OER Research Hub research framework is trying to accomplish. So social justice was also something that really stuck out to me because when I first started the doctoral program, I was kind of interested in how different student demographics and characteristics affect their ability to be successful in college or even attend college. I know for me, I'm a first generation graduate student. I had one other person in my family that got a bachelor's degree, but nobody has ever gotten a graduate degree. So for me, it was important to figure out my why and how I actually got here. And I see for a lot of other students, it's not as easy as it has been for me because I've been extremely lucky, but everybody else isn't as lucky and as fortunate as I am. So I really found this social justice topic to be really interesting. So one of the studies that we looked into this semester looked at three research questions. It looked at what is the impact of OER textbooks on academic performance quantified by evaluating final grades of D's, F's, and withdrawal letter grades. They also wondered if the use of OER textbooks affects students from a low socioeconomic background, such as those who qualified for federal Pell Grants, compared to students who didn't qualify for the federal Pell Grants. And last, they wondered if student performance increased significantly for those in underserved populations when a free OER textbook was used over a traditional textbook that students had to pay for. So the results of this study found that students performed better when courses used OER instead of expensive traditional textbooks. And the study also showed that the DFW rates also increased or decreased, I mean. And it shows that although OER provided benefits to all student groups, it was significantly better for those that were Pell Grant eligible, underserved populations, and part-time students. And it also found that final grades improved for all students when the OER was adopted. However, the improvements were more significant for non-white students. So I think this article and this study really showcased the benefits of OER, especially for different student groups. So I found this to be particularly interesting. So OER enabled pedagogy is something that is defined in many ways. Open pedagogy is defined in many different ways. You can ask somebody to define it, and they're going to tell you different than Sally told you over here. It's also used in many contexts, but it's associated with creating, using, and sharing OER. So Dr. Wiley and another research partner of his, Hilton, provided a new term called OER enabled pedagogy. And it's actually the set of teaching and learning practices that are only possible and practical in the context of the 5R permissions, which are characteristic of OER. So they really took something that was open pedagogy and they kind of created a different label for it and came up with a definition that really encompasses what they believe is true about OER and how we should be engaging in teaching and learning practices. I also found this idea of disposable and renewable assignments to be very, very interesting because I found myself reflecting back on how many disposable assignments I've created in my time as a student. So, a disposable assignment is an assignment that adds no value to the world, to the student, or their experience. It's just like a one and done thing. They write the paper, they learn from it, the teacher reads it, and they throw it away. A renewable assignment, however, is something that the students can create, they can share, they can openly publish it, and they can add value to their community, to their class, and to both their future and other learners' futures as well. So this 4-part test was created to determine if an assignment is renewable. So first you should ask yourself, are students asked to create new artifacts such as essays, poems, videos, songs, etc., or revise or remix existing OER? Does the new artifact have value beyond supporting the learning of its author? Are students invited to publicly share their new artifacts or revised remixed OER? And are students invited to openly license their new artifacts or revised remixed OER? So I think this is a great way to just ask yourself 4 simple questions to see if what you are engaging in is a renewable assignment. If not, maybe you should consider remixing your assignment and revising it to embrace this more renewable idea. So continuous improvement is repeated improvements of resources. And over the last year, I've become more familiar with the agile process, and I really think it's applicable here. I have learned that the ADDIE model and the way that the instructional design process goes, it's more of an iterative process. You do some design, you build and develop, and then you test that out. And then in another iteration, you're going to design some more, you're going to build, and you're going to test that out. And it's this iterative process. It's an iterative cycle. And really, I think that OER is a lot of that in the sense of continuous improvement. You're going to design this OER, or you're going to remix and revise this OER that you've already found. You're going to build it, you're going to develop it, you're going to make it your own. Then you're going to test it. You're going to roll it out depending on the situation. If you're in K-12, probably through the duration of a school year. But if you are in higher education, probably over the duration of a semester. So you're going to roll it out and you're going to test it with your students, and you're going to see what their learning experience was. Was it improved? Was it better? You're going to find things that need to be fixed. So guess what? You're going to go back, you're going to design some more to improve it. You're going to build these design and these improvements into it, and then you're going to retest it again next semester or next year, and then the next year you're going to do the same thing. So it's this iterative cycle that you're continually improving it and continually going back and designing and developing and testing, because it's not a one and done thing. It's never going to be perfect, and you're going to have to continually improve and revise. So to me, it's a lot like an iterative cycle. Rise plots are a great way to analyze assessment performance and content engagement, and to see if really the content that you're providing is aligning with the content in the assessment. And if not, there's probably something going on there that needs to be addressed. So this rise plot is broken up into 4 quadrants. Quadrant 1 up here represents a higher than average use and higher than average grades. So the students use the content more, they engage with the content more, and they get better grades. Over here, quadrant 2 represents lower than average use, but still higher than average grades. So they didn't engage with that content as much, but they still scored well. Quadrant 3 represents lower than average use and lower than average grades. So here you should probably start reassessing the content and your assessments and think about how you can improve that. And over here represents higher than average use but lower than average grades. So there's probably something not aligning. Your students are using the materials, but they're not getting better grades. So we need to revisit that, make improvements, and get them to a better quadrant. So you should really consider what's not aligning. The build, measure, and learn cycle really comes down to, once again, that iterative cycle. You're going to build your content, you're going to measure it, you're going to learn, and it really also comes in with ideas and your product and your data. So it starts with some ideas. You're going to think about these ideas and you're going to build upon those ideas. You're going to create a product and you're going to measure that probably through assessment of your learners to see if they've actually learned what they have. So you're going to look at that data that you get from your measurement and you're going to learn, okay, this didn't go so well. Okay, this went really well. And you're going to start generating ideas again and you're going to build another product. And it's just a cycle. So I thought that this was a really great visualization to show how you can engage in the idea of this process of fostering ideas, building upon those ideas to make something to then measure and have your data tell you what you need to do better. Sustainability is this idea of strengthening or supporting. It's linked to processes and practices, and it supports ongoing OER development and implementation. So it must be sustainable. Under the idea of sustainable is non-rivalrous, which means when one person uses the resource, others can also use it. Non-excludable means it's expensive or impossible to prevent others from using the resource. So you pretty much can't prevent or exclude people from using it. A common pool resource is expensive but impossible to prevent others. I think that's expensive but not impossible to prevent others from using the resource. So you could prevent others from using it, but it's going to cost you a lot of money. Enclosure means you take over and commercialize a shared resource, usually for personal gain. Public goods benefit all members of society, and they provide public value. And a free rider is a person who decides to exclude themselves from contributing to a group, so they let others pay for the public good. And then they free ride off of the purchase of others, so they then partake of that free good, but they let somebody else pay for it. So a lot of just key ideas to keep in mind as we're thinking about this idea of openness and idea of sharing and this idea of open education resources. So that leads us to the commons. And David Bollier does a great job of talking about what the commons is. So he says the commons is a social system for long-term stewardship of resources that preserves shared values and community identity. It's a self-organized system by which communities manage resources that are both depletable and replenishable, with minimal or no resilience on the market or state. The wealth that we inherit or create together and must pass on, undiminished or enhanced, to our children. Our collective wealth includes the gifts of nature, civic infrastructure, cultural works and traditions, and knowledge. And last, it's a sector of the economy and life that generates values in ways that are often taken for granted and often jeopardized by the market state. So there's some sustainability challenges. And the question is, how do we sustain OER? So how do we keep funding activities whose main purpose is to be free of charge once foundational funding goes away? So it really seems like we're approaching this problem backwards. And it's really this idea that everyone is looking for funding for a project. They want to do this huge project, but they don't know how they're going to get there without people giving them money. So for sustainability and scalability, it's problematic for people relying on others to do things for them. So it happens more readily when people do things for themselves. We need to centralize open education services to be less scalable and sustainable, and decentralizing them is more scalable and sustainable. So, really, we sustain OER by sharing, and we sustain it by using technology. It's easier to access the materials, but we need to try to think outside the box of how we can fund those projects. When Dr. Morin came to talk to us, that really resonated with me because she talked about other ways that they made their OER implementation possible. They really worked with the district, they worked with the teachers, and it was a sacrifice for them, but it wasn't a huge sacrifice. They were able to work over the summer and get a stipend to create their materials. They were able to take some time out of their workday to create the materials. And so I really think that there's other ways out there besides looking for funding and sources. I think that creating a plan and getting others on board and just having everyone pitch in can really help to, you know, drive this intrinsic motivation of doing things for themselves and for their students and for their university and eventually for the OER community. So OER is a foundation for innovation and experimentation. It really promotes that in a sense that we're sharing our ideas with others, we're sharing our work with others, and we're continuing to improve on that. We're continuing to innovate that. And we're just trying things and seeing what works best, what doesn't work best, and how we can really continue to improve and make education better for our students. And last, there's really three ideas of the 3S model that was talked about as a holistic framework. So it's the S3 model that Dr. Wiley created. And it's broken down into three areas: student success, scale, and savings. Dr. Wiley argues that student success is the most important, and it's defined as completing a course with a final grade that counts towards graduation. So the impact is clearly seen more readily in final grades in the C and D range. So the second and next most important category is scale. And scale is defined as the proportion of students being reached. So the number of students in OER sections versus the number of students in all sections. So the last piece is savings, and it's defined as the amount of money spent on course materials by the average student using OER compared to the amount of money spent on course materials by the average control student. So we're comparing the average amount spent between students that used OER versus traditional. So the savings counts for a variety of different factors, and then he comes up with an overall score calculation formula. So you take the impact is equal to 4 times the success rate plus 2 times the scale plus 1 times the savings. So this S3 model is really focused on 3 questions. How much does this innovation improve student success? How many of our students are benefiting from this innovation? And how much money does this innovation save students? So last, my main takeaway from this semester is that OER is only going to continue to grow. I have learned so much about OER this semester. I had kind of heard about OER. I had used it a little bit here and there, like finding a resource and being able to use it. And it wasn't something that I readily searched for. It was just something more that I had come across as I was digging for information and things. So there are many things that we can do, especially now that we have an increased awareness and sense for what OER is and the goals that it's seeking to accomplish. I think that there are so many things we can do to help and contribute to OER. We can be part of that community, and we can continue to empower others to learn and share, and continue to share our knowledge and what we've learned with others, and continue to share our resources with others, and just continue to expand in the OER, because I think that's really important. This is something that I've learned a lot about. I really align with the goals of what OER is seeking to do. And I just think it's really important to continue sharing that with others. So that was my main takeaway from this semester. So thank you for sticking this out with me, for listening to me talk about what I've learned this semester. I could go on for another few hours about everything that I found interesting. But thank you for listening. And if you want to talk more about this with me, feel free to reach out.